Speaking of shocking, I can tell you a thing or two about how many shocking things have taken place. I've mentioned my friend who was training in the same year as myself and resides in London. Back then she also registered as a pharmacist, but had a terrible year like myself and was terribly bullied and harassed in central London, where she was training in one or two large treating hospitals. In sharp contrast to myself, I ended up training in a rural district general hospital in Carmarthen. Nonetheless, we did keep in touch, and it was in the training year that she was able to tell me, or more like confirm over the phone, that she had come to hear that my paediatric tutor had accessed my medical notes. Now, I've already told you that that was my suspicion, and if I can just show you something else here, this. The Section 60 pharmacy order came in 2007. That's just when they were planning to get rid of me in Barnsley Hospital. That's it, yes. Prior to that, the Royal Society, the RPSGB, because the General Pharmaceutical Council weren't in existence at the time of my training, and neither were they in existence a few years later either, following on from my training. The RPSGB were monitoring individuals unknown to themselves. That was my hunch during 1998 and 1999, and that hunch was confirmed. If you read this article, which has been published in the Pharmaceutical Journal back in 2007, it's currently, it's 2018, July, you'll notice that the feelings that are induced within individuals who are the recipients of the Section 60 pharmacy order are totally in alignment with my own personal sentiments, and that doesn't mean I'm paranoid. They do make you feel as though you are a criminal, and the really shocking thing is that the evidence is actually against the very people who arranged for my departure from Barnsley Hospital and bullied me in my training year in Carmarthen. And last but not least, this individual, Mr. Graham Savile Edwards, should by now have shed light on the murder of this woman and the uncanny resemblance between her and his provisional only client, myself. I wasn't actually a client in the end, because he refused to instruct me to attend the hearing. He told me not to go to the hearing, and neither did he actually hang around to continue with my case, because of the nature of the way in which he interacted with me over the telephone. We didn't actually manage to secure any final conclusion, and instead my what do they call them in pharmacy, the hearings, the interim, they have a period in which they suspend you from working. That interim just continued endlessly, and it seems to me that's what his intention was, for it to continue endlessly. They have absolutely no evidence that I have any degenerative condition. They have been trying to pull evidence or arrange evidence that I've committed a crime, but I've actually caught them out whilst they've been doing it, because I too have managed to keep my wits about myself, keep my wits about me, and managed to research and find out more about the manner in which members who affiliate very closely to the Royal Society and the General Pharmaceutical Council, how they conduct themselves. I would like to put a very direct question to Mr. Graham Savile Edwards, and it goes as follows. Mr. Graham Savile Edwards, how can you tell me that this is a coincidence? This woman was murdered within weeks of you and I being introduced to one another. This is 2009. You and I were introduced to each other via my friend, who for many weeks was asking me to sign up with a barrister. She suggested, or recommended rather, that I join yourself because I didn't have a barrister. I had no legal representation which was suitable for the occasion, and she told me that she had a barrister and gave me your telephone number. So she must have told you that she had a friend, and even if she didn't, Mr. Graham Savile Edwards, I'm sure you would have been aware of Miss Mubbina Hashmi. This lady was murdered in July 2009, which is almost exactly the same time Mr. Graham Savile Edwards and I were first acquainted to one another. You then resumed by requesting my medical notes. These are my medical notes, or at least this is one page from my medical notes. Look at that. 32-year-old pharmacist. I remind you, Mr. Graham Savile Edwards is resident himself in Austria, which is right next door to this lady who lives in Germany. Austria is also a German-speaking province, so it's quite closely linked to Germany, not just geographically, but they do actually speak the same language as well. Now, the other thing is, we both are Muslims, we both wear headscarves, we were both pharmacists. I have a history of people trying to tell me to get out of pharmacy. My close friend was forced out of pharmacy because she knew about the accessing of my medical notes by the pediatric pharmacist tutor, who was very keen to have me, and she herself was being very badly bullied and harassed. Now, the media have refused to acknowledge that Marwa El-Sherbini's case was actually the result of sheer hatred, which came from the individual known as Alexander Wines, or Alex Wines, as he's known. They just refused to accept that it was Islamophobic, and it was rather driven by some other sentiments. Now, he's actually assaulted her verbally by calling her a terrorist and Islamist whore. Islamist whore, that was the theme that I had to familiarize myself with when I had to deal with my training year in Carmarthen, and also a few times whilst I was in Barnsley Hospital, where I was told to leave my job. Eventually, the NHS Trust in Carmarthen succeeded in their initial venture, which was to get rid of me by requesting that their successors in Barnsley took over the job and saw it through to the end. The knife theme turns up initially in Barnsley Hospital. In Carmarthen Hospital. I apologise for that. In Carmarthen Hospital, where I was training. And this is where the knife was found, in the paediatric ward door, or the special care baby unit ward door. Young people. The paediatric tutor herself used to go there and wouldn't let me anywhere near there. And I was being called a psychopath. I was being told I had been abused as a child and that I would grow up to abuse. So I was very wary of the plans that this department had in mind for myself. At the time, I was living in Carmarthen whilst I was training, but then I came back and lived in Bristol. I am the youngest child, and so there were no other children other than my brother's two babies who had been born whilst I was doing my training year. You could say the writing was on the wall, and those comments were a good indication of what was to come. And the amazing thing is, I've never been proven wrong. Going back to the knife theme, the knife was found in the door, and the police were involved. A stocking was tied to my door handle and to other females who shared the same landing as myself. A gun was found downstairs. The gun turns up again when Marwa El-Sherbini's husband is shot and stabbed, and Marwa is actually stabbed herself to death. That is very worrying. The similarities are very worrying. Mr. Graham Savile Edwards, I am actually addressing Mr. Graham Savile Edwards, and I really do think you need to do something about this. I'm afraid to tell you directly, because I believe you already know. You were resident in Austria, and this lady's story did appear on the headlines. They didn't allow it to be publicised as it should have been, because as you can see, let me just show you. Outrage at lack of media coverage fuels protest. That was 9 years from now, from this month. Today is July 2018. It's clear that the media didn't want to acknowledge this case, perhaps because they knew about my case, and Barnsley Hospital are already guilty of leaking highly confidential information to the media. Just have a close look at that. This is just a few months before I was told to leave, May 2007. My purpose in writing to all staff is to say that a culture of leaking information to the press is damaging to the reputation of the organisation as a whole, as well as causing personal anxiety and concern to those staff directly affected. Well, I was affected, and yes, it has induced incredible anxiety in my life. I'm not even allowed to say I'm anxious without being labelled as somebody who's got schizophrenia. Is that fair, I ask you? Now, I have contacted the Trust going back a few years, and as you would expect, they've denied that this is that case, which is outrageous, isn't it? I mean, how many times, how many other people have they done this to? We can see that that matches completely with that. My case precedes this lady's case. My other permanent role in Carmarthen involves a knife and a gun, and the marking of myself with a sock tied or a stocking tied to my door handle, where I was living on site in the nurses' wing. This is Marwa's photograph and her husband's photograph. This man was also stabbed and shot. How can you play so stupid and pretend that I have paranoia and I'm making this all up? And this isn't the only time that the knife actually shows up. It shows up again. This is one of the worst cases I know where the knife turns up. There's also another case where another woman, like this lady here, Marwa El-Sherbini, another female Muslim headscarfed resident in Europe from the Middle East, known as Nahid Al-Mania. She also gets stabbed, I believe, 16 times to death whilst she is making her way to university, the University of Essex, and she doesn't succeed because she is killed on the way, and that is the end of that. Her case resembles both my case and the late Marwa El-Sherbini's case. She too is described as a 32-year-old headscarfed woman. Isn't that shocking? And her case was linked to another case that I was having to battle out at the time when I was trying to join a gym here, and I was told to get out on account of my Muslim attire. This isn't rocket science to be able to join the dots and decipher that these so-called coincidences have in fact been organised, highly organised, by the UK establishments, who have yet to allow for an investigation. Mr. Graham Savile Edwards has stayed very quiet, and instead I am being scrutinised further wherever I go. I'm also afraid for my friend, her safety and well-being. She resides in London. She was sectioned off. Can you believe it? Most likely because she was a victim and also a reliable witness.